Not long ago, Mrs. Hurst's only son died. He died as a hero, but it didn't make it any easier for a mother's heart. And now, walking along the path to her son's grave, Mrs. Hurst reproached herself for one thing. Why did she agree to have Gregor buried here in the city? It would have been better to bury him in his hometown, next to his father's grave, where she too would be soon. She didn't have long left, at least that's what the grief-stricken mother thought. Grief had stunned her and crushed her heart, and now it had not let go for 40 days. Yeah, today was 40 days since Gregor passed away. When it came to the question of burial, Mrs. Hurst agreed to his friend Fred's suggestion. Let Gregor rest at the city cemetery. His family was here, his wife, but they never had children with Gregor. Heather was a beautiful, smart woman from a wealthy family. Mrs. Hurst thought that her son and his wife were soulmates. Only at the funeral did she realize how wrong she was. Heather, who was frankly bored of her husband's funeral, didn't even shed a tear. If it weren't for her mourning attire, no one would have believed that she had become a widow. Heather was practically yawning. It was clear that the ceremony was just a burden to her. She didn't even kiss her husband goodbye or stay for the memorial. Neither did her parents. And Gregor died because of a fire in the warehouse where building materials were stored. Gregor was the first to rush to save the workers who were locked in one of the rooms. He saved everyone, 3 labourers, and himself, after inhaling smoke, died in the hospital unconscious. Yes, Gregor was a hero. He had been one since childhood. Mrs. Hurst slowly walked along the path, remembering how her son saved and healed everyone, from cats and dogs to pigeons, at a young age. He always helped the elderly neighbours, whether by watering the garden or running to the store. Well, and he didn't forget about the household chores. He had a kind heart. Mrs. Hurst and her husband only supported their son and often said, "Doing good is right. It will come back to you." They thought he would become a doctor or a veterinarian, but Gregor went to a construction college. Well, it's also a good profession. His parents didn't argue, they were just happy for their son. He was their late child, born when Mrs. Hurst was already over 40, a real miracle. When Gregor was in his second year of college, his father suddenly died. His heart just stopped. Mrs. Hurst thought she would die of grief herself, but the thought of her son kept her going. In his 3rd year, Gregor started to work to make it easier for his mother. She scolded him, saying that his main job was to study, and providing for him was her concern. She worked as a teacher in the village, earning a little, but what did she need? Everything was for her son. However, Gregor just waved it off. He couldn't just sit on his mother's back and do nothing. So from his college years on, he gradually began to get involved in business. And after graduation, he opened his first construction company, which gradually expanded. Of course, he wasn't a millionaire, but he was able to buy a house, a car, and renovate a house for his mother in the village. She was already retired at the time. And then Gregor got married. Mrs. Hurst didn't like her daughter-in-law at first, a spoiled city girl, the daughter of a local banker. But she didn't have to live with her. The main thing was that Gregor liked her, and everything seemed to be good for them. Of course, Heather didn't communicate much with her mother-in-law and never came to the village. The in-laws also appreciated the choice of their daughter, but they felt Gregor had a business talent and would go far. Moreover, he loved their daughter, spoiled her, and fulfilled all of her whims. Heather used to change expensive jewellery regularly, disappear into expensive boutiques and travel to resorts. Gregor fulfilled all his wife's wishes, and they looked like a perfectly happy couple. Therefore, when there was a disaster with Gregor, Mrs. Hurst couldn't even imagine that his wife and her parents would forget him so quickly. Mrs. Hurst approached her son's grave. Her throat choked with a lump, and tears poured from her eyes. It seemed that she had cried all her tears during these 40 days. But as soon as she found herself at her son's grave, the pain pierced her again with renewed force. Crying, Mrs. Hurst found the strength to remove the withered flowers from the grave, wipe the photograph on the cross, and put fresh roses in a vase. Then her legs gave way and she collapsed on her son's grave and sobbed. It seemed that no force would lift her any more, and no one would help her. But there is probably a limit to everything in the body, even the number of tears. Mrs. Hurst quieted down, sighed and struggled to get up. She stood and silently looked at her son's photograph. Then her gaze turned to the sky. Yes, somewhere there was her son. Suddenly she heard laughter behind her. It was very sharp and did not fit into the cemetery atmosphere. Mrs. Hurst shuddered and turned her head, and then she immediately met Heather's eyes. The former daughter-in-law was standing next to her. "Hello, Heather," said Mrs. Hurst, trying not to pay attention to the woman's cold gaze. "You came. You didn't forget. Today is the 40th day since Gregor's death." "So what?" Heather smirked. "I'm here for other things, just passing by." Poor, shocked mother was lost for words. Only now did she see that Heather was not alone. A man in an expensive suit was standing next to her. He clearly whispered something amusing to his companion. There was a half-smile on his face now, and Heather was smiling too. And all this ugly, unbelievable scene was next to her husband's grave, 40 days after his burial. "Darling, let's go," Heather's companion said. "I'll just put some flowers on my grandma's grave. It's her anniversary today." "Yes, dear," Heather replied, and they walked past Gregor's grave. Mrs. Hurst stood there feeling disgusted. Heather was already with another man, and the grandmother of her lover was more important than her own husband. "Is that his mother?" Heather's companion's voice reached Mrs. Hurst. Yes, a peasant woman, and her son was the same. Heather waved her hand contemptuously. "And the child? Have you decided what to do with him?" asked the man. "Yes, everything is already decided. I don't need a child from a loser." They talked as if Mrs. Hurst was a Pole or nothing. But the elderly woman, hearing about the child, stirred. She rushed after her former daughter-in-law and grabbed her hand. "Heather, are you pregnant? My dear, don't commit a sin. It's my grandson, the only thing left of Gregor," she said, worried and looking into her daughter-in-law's eyes. But Heather's pretty face was distorted with a smirk. She abruptly pulled her hand out of Mrs. Hurst's hand and said angrily, "What child? You're a crazy old woman. Have you completely lost your mind?" "But you just said..." Mrs. Hurst was bewildered. "Take my advice. Don't listen to other people's conversations." Heather flared up. "Stupid countrywoman. Do you think I would give birth to a child from your loser son? Why would I need that? Not only did he die, but his company went bankrupt too." "How did it go bankrupt? Everything was going well for him." "Yes, it was going well," Heather sneered, "but only for a while. Recently he got in debt up to his ears. That's it, go away." And Heather, taking her companion's hand, clacked her heels on the path. Mrs. Hurst returned to her son's grave and collapsed on her knees. "Is it really true, my son? I don't understand," she whispered. The poor mother looked up at the sky, so pure and blue. It seemed that under such a sky there could be no evil, pain, loss or deceit. But in reality it was all there. Mrs. Hurst was sitting for a long time, with no thoughts in her head, just a dull pain. She did not see how Heather and her companion walked back, not even paying attention to her former mother-in-law. Nor did the grieving woman hear the singing of birds or the distant noise of the city. The poor woman was consumed by her grief. Yes, her son had been living, trying and doing something, but eventually no one would remember him except his mother. And unfortunately, Gregor left no trace on this earth. Mrs. Hurst did not know how long she had been sitting there when, suddenly, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was Fred, Gregor's friend. Someone still remembered her son. The woman answered the call. "Hello, Mrs. Hurst, are you at the cemetery?" asked Fred. "Yes, I am," she replied. "Can you wait for me there? I just got off work. We can go to a cafe then and remember Gregor." "Yes, okay," the woman agreed, and an hour later they were sitting in a small cafe. The piece of food wouldn't go down. Mrs. Hurst's throat and anger toward Heather made her chest feel tight. How could she say that about her son? And what child was she talking about? Mrs. Hurst decided to tell Fred about her meeting with Heather. Fred listened attentively, then sighed and told her everything. Yes, Gregor had problems at work in the last few months. Suppliers had given them inferior materials. Then there was a serious defect during construction, and investigations had begun. Gregor was at the end of his mental and emotional strength. His banker father-in-law could have helped but refused. All because Heather and Gregor were heading towards divorce. For 3 months she had been cheating on her husband with a young and promising son of her father's friend. "My poor son," whispered Mrs. Hurst. "Why didn't he tell me anything?" He was reluctant to. Fred sighed and fell silent, clearly not daring to say anything else. "And the child?" the woman remembered. "Heather talked about a child." And then Fred realized that he had already told one thing. So he had to say the other. Gregor had long wanted a child, but Heather was against it. She didn't want to ruin her figure. But then one day, before the family relationship broke down completely, they agreed with Gregor. If she didn't want to give birth herself, they would use the services of a surrogate mother. Gregor paid for all the expenses, and soon a young woman was found who agreed to carry their child. At first everything was good, but then the problems started at the firm. Finances went bad, and Heather started cheating him. Gregor didn't care, he just wanted to be a father no matter what. "What happened to this woman?" Mrs. Hurst asked, turning pale, expecting to hear the worst. "Don't worry so much," Fred hurried to reassure her. "As far as I know, she should still be pregnant. Unless what? Unless Heather demanded to get rid of it at any time, as she has full right under the contract. Honestly, I thought she'd already done it. I didn't interfere in the matter, and I didn't tell you anything at first because I thought it was only Gregor and Heather's business." "What a horror!" the woman sobbed. "Fred, help me find her. Maybe it's not too late. You know her, don't you?" "I've seen her a few times when Gregor drove her to the clinic. I only know she's from an orphanage. Her name is Jennifer, and she already has a daughter." Fred thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement, saying, "I'll find her, I promise." The next day, Fred was able to get an answer from the Family Planning Centre for a generous fee. It turned out that Heather had demanded that the surrogate mother have an abortion at 6 months of pregnancy. The centre refused her request, but promised to give the child up for adoption immediately after birth. However, the surrogate mother suddenly disappeared. She moved out of her rented apartment, her phone was silent, and she was not at her home address. Heather cancelled the contract. Finding Jennifer seemed impossible, but Fred, feeling guilty towards his deceased friend, was able to do it. He used old connections in the police and even had to hire a detective. And so Mrs. Hurst received the cherished address. It turned out that Jennifer had moved to the suburbs and settled with a friend from the orphanage. She ran away from Heather because what the widow of Gregor demanded was unthinkable. To Jennifer's fortune, Heather didn't bother to look for her, deciding that cancelling the contract freed her from the obligations and from the inconvenience of an unwanted child. And now Mrs. Hurst found herself in front of a small, neat house, hesitating to enter. Eventually, she pulled the latch on the gate and stepped into the courtyard. The first thing she saw was a 5-year-old girl sitting by the flower bed and drawing something on the ground with a stick. "Hello, who are you looking for?" the girl asked curiously. "I think your mother," the elderly woman stammered. "Just a moment." The girl nodded understandingly and ran into the house. Soon, a tall, slender woman appeared on the porch with no hint of pregnancy. Mrs. Hurst's heart sank. Did Jennifer get rid of the child after all? "Are you Jennifer?" Mrs. Hurst asked, her voice trembling. "No." The woman looked at the guest suspiciously. "Why do you need her?" Anxious, Mrs. Hurst explained. The homeowner listened, then said that Jennifer went to the market. The answer surprised the old woman. "To the market in the 9th month?" "I can't invite you into the house," the hostess said. "It's not tidy here, but you can wait for her on the bench." Mrs. Hurst nodded obediently, went outside and sat on the bench. Several times she noticed the little girl running up to the fence and seeing her rushing into the house, apparently reporting that she had not left yet. Soon at the end of the street, Mrs. Hurst saw a pregnant woman. She could barely walk, holding a bulky and apparently heavy package in one hand, and the other hand was tightly holding the hand of the girl, the same age as the one who was running in the yard. The pregnant woman approached the house. "Are you Jennifer?" Mrs. Hurst ran up to her. "Yes," the woman said cautiously and sighed, putting down the heavy package. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "My name is Mrs. Hurst. I am Gregor's mother." "Why are you here? I have already told you that I will not get rid of the child, and it's too late. And I won't give him to an orphanage." Jennifer's voice trembled and her lips quivered. "My dear, what are you saying? You're so smart. It's good that you didn't listen to Heather." Mrs. Hurst was also nervous, barely holding back tears. "I didn't know anything. I could barely find you." "Why?" Jennifer asked softly. "To tell you that you can rely on me completely. I'll help you, and if you don't want to raise this child, I'll take him," Mrs. Hurst said. "I won't give him to anyone," Jennifer whispered almost inaudibly. "He's mine." She said it and burst into tears. Mrs. Hurst hugged her, trying to calm her down, and she herself burst into tears. "Oh, why are we crying here?" she realized suddenly. "Maybe we should come into the house, although your friend isn't very friendly." When she mentioned the homeowner, Jennifer darkened. "Can I trust you?" she asked. "Completely," Mrs. Hurst assured her. "Then let's step away a bit." Jennifer left the package at the gate and waddled like a duck to the bench across the road. The girl obediently followed, and Mrs. Hurst followed them. They were already sitting on the bench, and when Jennifer's friend looked out from her house, looked unkindly in their direction, took the package with groceries and disappeared back. "Why are you carrying such heavy loads? You're going to give birth soon," Mrs. Hurst remarked. "I have no choice," sighed Jennifer. "Pamela and I grew up in the orphanage together. She was the only one who agreed to take me in, but I have to help her with everything." And Jennifer told her whole story. After the orphanage, she learned to be a cook and worked in a small bakery. Then she met a guy and they fell in love, but he left her as soon as he heard about her pregnancy. Jennifer gave birth to a daughter and lived in a dorm room allocated to her by the state as an orphan. The room was awful. The corners were covered in mould and the ceiling was leaking. Because of this, her daughter often fell ill. The doctors insisted on changing the housing, otherwise Lisa's lungs could develop a disease. But how to find new housing? Rent? She didn't have spare money. And then Jennifer saw an advertisement for surrogacy. She decided that this was her chance to get out of poverty. Unfortunately, she had no other way to save her daughter. The clinic made a contract with her. Customers were found, Heather and Gregor. Pregnancy came and Gregor rented an apartment for Jennifer and Lisa. Finally, she could live a normal life. At first, Jennifer didn't think it would be so difficult, but over time she began to understand what a trap she had fallen into. Every day she became more and more attached to the baby she carried in her heart. Yes, She understood that he was a stranger to her by blood, but he was still her baby. One day she confessed this to Gregor, who was the only one involved in her life. His wife Heather had completely distanced herself. And then Gregor confessed that he and his wife were getting a divorce. He promised that he would not separate her from the child. He even hinted at a relationship. Oh, how happy Jennifer was at that moment. And then Gregor died, and Heather remembered about her. She did not intend to pay money for an unwanted baby, and, therefore by deception, brought Jennifer to the clinic. And Jennifer accidentally overheard a conversation between Heather and the doctor about a termination or orphanage. Jennifer was so scared she could not allow it. Jennifer ran away from the clinic, taking her daughter from the kindergarten. She aimlessly wandered around the city, afraid to return to the dormitory or rented apartment, because she understood that Heather would find her there. And then she accidentally met Pamela. They were never friends, just acquaintances. Pamela, listening to Jennifer, offered to help, but it was not for free. In exchange for a roof over her head, Pamela demanded that Jennifer work for her as a housekeeper or something. Pamela wanted to live like a queen. Jennifer understood that Pamela would eventually kick her out when the baby is born. She won't be able to work at her. And Jennifer was terrified of ending up with 2 children on the street. She would have to go back to her room in the dormitory. But just the thought of the damp, dark room made her want to cry. Besides, Heather could not show up again, so Jennifer felt trapped again. Mrs. Hurst listened to Jennifer, and she was going to help this unhappy woman and her daughter, who looked at her with frightened eyes. "Girls, why don't you come to my village?" Mrs. Hurst suddenly suggested. "I have a good house, a garden. The children will be happy there." "Are you serious?" Jennifer whispered, confused. "I'm nobody to you, and neither is my daughter." "How can you say that?" Mrs. Hurst smiled. "You are the mother of my grandson or granddaughter." "You'll have a grandson." "Well, there you go. My grandson. That means you're my family. And Lisa will be my granddaughter." On the same day, Jennifer, Lisa and Mrs. Hurst left for the village. Soon, Mrs. Hurst's grandson was born at the regional maternity hospital. Now the elderly woman had someone to live for, and she is willing to wait for at least 20 more years before going to the other side.